for a father to make a promise to his children. If I promise to my children, if you can clean up your room really well this week, then on Saturday we're going to go out and get some ice cream, right? Then my kids are understanding that, hey, Dad's promising us ice cream if we clean our room, and that ice cream's going to come on Saturday, right? And so let's say that Saturday comes and I take them out to get cake. I know this is a basic example, but they say, Dad, you promised us ice cream, right? So for me to be true to my promise, I need to give them ice cream because that's what I promised. And that's the way it is with God's faithfulness and the Scriptures, is that God has made promises. And He's promised to do certain things in certain ways at different times. And He's made strong promises, covenant promises, that He's actually so strong that He's confirmed them with oaths. That, for example, Genesis 15, that He wanted to make that promise extra strong, extra firm in Abraham's mind, to the point where he actually did something that in ancient cultures was part of a covenant forming ceremony, where they would actually cut animals in two, and the people who were coming to the covenant would walk between the different pieces of the dead animals and actually invoke divine sanction against themselves, or they would devote. Basically, it had the divine weight and sanction to it, sobriety, and it was solemn. Basically saying, if I don't do what I have just promised in this covenant, may I be cut to pieces like that animal. And so the person who watched the person making that oath, they knew that this was serious, that this person was going to fulfill this promise. And in fact, in ancient covenants, they would actually invoke a deity, right? In the case of the biblical God, the true God, they would call on the name of the Lord as a witness to the covenant, because they actually believed that they would enforce it. It wasn't empty words. It wasn't empty promises. And so this just shows you, these weren't just promises. These were solemn promises. They were confirmed promises. They had a sworn oath. And so the question is, God's really intent and serious about giving His kids ice cream. So the thing is, you've got to understand what the promise is. If you're going to cling to a promise, then you've got to really take the time and go into the Old Testament Scriptures to work through, what did God actually promise? And when God said to Abraham, Abraham, I'm going to give you this land, He meant ice cream and not cake. See what I'm saying? That when He promised Abraham, I'm going to make you into a great nation, and that from you will come a great community of nations, an assembly of nations, that I will make you a father of many nations, that in you or through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed, that Abraham understood nations as nations, and that he understood seed as seed, descendants, that he understood land as land, not spiritual land, but the land. And in fact, a piece of land that was geographically assigned with clear boundaries, right? And that Abraham was clinging to that promise. And to inherit, God promised Abraham a certain piece of land forever. Well, how can Abraham inherit and receive a piece of land forever if he dies? So even in there's the hope of resurrection. Again, it's in seed form there. But there's an implied resurrection, bodily resurrection, to receive that land forever. He needs to be raised from the dead and walk on that land. And so, having clarity about the promise, and that promise is based in the Old Testament Scriptures, so that by the time we get to the New Testament, we're not turning ice cream into cake. And we can cling to what God actually promised, and that we're not just saying that God has promised this, and God has promised that, and God has promised this, and God has promised that, when when that's not actually what he promised. And so if it's not what he actually promised, then it's not something you can cling to with the certainty of an oath and all of those rituals that went with those covenants. And so to be faithful for God to be faithful means to be faithful to what? To his promise. His promises are assured with things like oath. They're covenant promises. They're strong, firm, reliable promises. And to know what he's being faithful to, you have to know what the promises are. Those promises are in the Old Testament scriptures. And so if you're going to know what is awaiting us on that day, you've got to get your foundation there and spend time there and not twist the promises, not spiritualize the promises, not theologize yourself out of the promises, these types of things. But realize that, no, these promises, as Abraham received them, as he would have clearly understood them, is the same way that God will actually fulfill them. That there's not a shift from Old Testament to New Testament. There's not a shift from ice cream to cake.